Thank you so much, Naomi. I appreciate the very generous introduction. And I just want to say thank you to ICPSR and to Mike Traugott for the invitation. And it's an honor to be speaking as part of the Blaylock Lecture Series because so much of my work is in the tradition of his work. And I also just want to say a special thanks to Naomi, not only for putting this all together and being the ultimate organizer, but for stepping up and doing an amazing job as host in the midst of all of the power outages that they're experiencing in Michigan right now. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. I'm going to look to Naomi to make sure you can see that. All right. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a bit about the work that I have been doing recently, but I'm going to talk about how I've been extending largely the work that I have done and present in my 2019 book, White Identity Politics. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time than I might normally spend talking a bit about measurement and what I see as the best practices for measuring racial identity today, especially in light of the fact that this is ICPSR talk. And so I want to begin by setting the landscape for you all, a landscape that is certainly very familiar to any of you who have been paying attention to politics for the past 10 years or so. And I want to start by talking about the fact that right around 2011, in the wake of the 2010 census, the news began covering quite widely the fact that the census was projecting whites' numerical decline in the United States. Now, this wasn't new information. Demographers had been projecting that whites were going to lose their numerical majority in the United States for some time. But media attention to this really picked up in the wake of the 2010 census. And for those of you who have been reading the news this week, you might have seen, and you are going to see an increase in coverage of the 2020 census results, which are now coming to light. And there's a growing number of articles that have already been featured that discuss the fact that the numerical decline that whites are experiencing has actually accelerated and is happening much faster than people expected. So we're going to see, we saw in 2011 an increase in coverage about whites' numerical decline in the United States population, and we're about to see a significant amount of coverage, I believe, of these trends now in the next weeks and in the coming months. And of course, in 2008, whites lost their monopoly on the US presidency with the election of the nation's first African-American president. And then in 2016, white Americans elected a rather unconventional presidential candidate, one who openly disparaged racial and ethnic minorities, one who was slow to distance himself from the endorsement of white nationalists and white supremacists, a person who was a presidential candidate took up rather unconventional policy positions compared to the standard Republican Party platform. And leading up to Donald Trump's successful presidential election and over the course of his presidency, we also saw the rise of white supremacist groups and ideologies. And we saw a lot of these attitudes becoming closer to mainstream discourse in the United States. And then we also saw the significant erosion of democratic norms over the Trump presidency. And what I would say is a surprising failure, surprising to many of the American public to decry this democratic backsliding. And these attitudes culminated with misleading claims that the 2020 presidential election was fraudulent and the widespread belief among many white Trump supporters that the outcome of the 2020 election was illegitimate. And ultimately, this led to the violent storming of the US Capitol building by Trump supporters as Congress met to certify the 2020 election. So we have this landscape before us. And there's some interesting things that we started observing in public opinion research over the Trump era, really, I think, beginning with and over the course of the Obama era, but surely escalating over the course of the Trump presidency. And so one thing to think about is like, how do we understand the attitudes and beliefs possessed by many white people that are, to some extent, a product of the increasing diversity in the United States and the Obama era and the Trump era? And then how do we understand their consequences? And one thing that we've observed, for example, is that many white Americans have, more so than they ever have in the past, started reporting that their group experiences more racial discrimination than racial and ethnic minorities do in the United States. And so what I'm going to argue is one way to understand this landscape is that there's a sense of white grievance, or the belief among some white Americans that their group is threatened and that it experiences some marked degree of racial discrimination. Now, what's interesting about this and why this is kind of a novel way of understanding whites' attitudes about race is that it's one that social scientists have largely overlooked or studied or failed to study or dismissed in the study of white racism in political science and social psychology and across other social sciences. Really, for the past 50 years, really more than 50 years, when we think about white racial attitudes, we've largely thought about the concept of prejudice, or the irrational outward hostility that some white people have toward people of color in the United States. And we viewed these attitudes as largely a learned set of beliefs, ones that many white people have been socialized to adopt, that they then carry them into adulthood, and that they then inform their political beliefs and preferences. And so for the most part, these attitudes have been out-group oriented. They have not been about how white people feel about themselves or their racial group. They have been largely about the sense of hostility that they feel for people of color. When we think about racism in the United States, that's generally the definition that we give of racism, of white racism. And what I'm going to argue is that we need to expand that definition. And to get you there, I want to take a step back, get us out of the domain for just a moment of thinking about racial attitudes and racial prejudice, and just put us in sort of the more general domain of social psychology. And one thing that social psychologists have told us for really most of the history of social psychology is that humans have a tendency to categorize and to sort the world into groups. And we have this sort of inevitable tendency to see ourselves as part of an in-group and to see other people who aren't like us in some meaningful ways, or not necessarily terribly meaningful ways, as being part of an out-group. And one consequence of that categorization is sometimes we tend to display some degree of out-group derogation or out-group animosity, but more often than not, we tend to show a degree of in-group favoritism. We like our group, we want to protect our group, or we feel a sense of belonging toward our group, and we want to preserve the resources that our group has and get our group more resources. But the interesting thing is that this sense of group dynamics, this way of thinking about groups, has not really been widely applied to understanding white racism in the United States. And part of the reason is that in the US, when it comes to race, we don't just divide the world into groups in some egalitarian kind of way. We also have a racial hierarchy with white people at the top as the dominant group. And not just with respect to their numerical majority in the United States, but because white Americans possess the overwhelming share of economic, political, and social power and resources. And for most of the time, this arrangement has led to some common assumptions about the way in which whites consider their racial group, or actually, is what I'm going to say, is fail to consider their racial group. They don't think about their racial group. And so common assumptions in the study of racism in the United States are that outgroup animus and racial prejudice are pervasive. They're pervasive in politics, and that white in-group attitudes are far less consequential. And that's because of whites' dominant status at the top of that racial hierarchy, they've been able to take their race for granted. They have the privilege of not thinking about their race. They therefore don't think about their in-group attitudes. They don't have this strong sense of feeling or solidarity with their own racial group. Those feelings, to the extent that they have existed, they haven't been particularly salient or relevant, particularly in the domain of politics. And so what I'm doing in my work is I'm revising some of these common assumptions, and I'm arguing is that many white Americans do identify with their race in a way that reinforces racism in the racial hierarchy in the United States. And this is an attitude that's independent of outgroup prejudice. It doesn't mean that it's unrelated to outgroup prejudice, but is its own separate psychological function. And that these attitudes can be politically consequential. They are, in fact, strongly associated with political attitudes and behaviors under certain conditions. So what are those conditions? My argument is that in response to threats to their status atop that racial hierarchy, when whites feel that their place at the top is no longer secure and their privileges and advantages are challenged, that's the circumstances under which we would expect to see white racial solidarity can become activated, making it a significant feature of whites' political evaluations. So a way of thinking about this is when white status is secure at the top, that racial hierarchy makes their racial identity invisible. But when that status becomes threatened in some way, whites start becoming far more aware of themselves as a racial group with interests that they need to preserve and protect. And my argument ultimately is that this is another way of thinking about and understanding racism. Racism not just as the outward hostility that some white people might have toward people of color in the United States, but racism also as a desire to protect whites' power and status and privileges in the United States. And we can think of these feelings and these thoughts as two separate constructs that are working sometimes in tandem and sometimes in different directions. But they're both forces in contemporary American politics. So how did we get here? Well, the sort of obvious thing is that as the US has become more diverse via immigration and differences in birth rates, and as some of the consequences of that diversity have emerged, like the very symbolic election of Barack Obama, some white people have felt some sense of anxiety. They're worried about their numerical decline, a numerical decline that they are worried about because the media has widely covered this. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we're going to see an increase in coverage of this. There's already been articles coming out this week about whites' numerical decline. And they're worried about the loss of privileges that they might experience as a product of this decline. So today, again, what I'm arguing is that we've got these two forces and the hostility that they have, that some white people have towards some people of color, and then also this set of in-group attitudes that are driving the way that many whites view the political world. So what are some of the consequences of white racial solidarity? So the particular political preferences implicated in white grievance politics are those that are related to whites' interests in protecting their group's status and power. So that ought to include things like opposition to immigration, opposition to Barack Obama, support for Donald Trump, who many white Americans arguably saw as helping to restore, preserve, or protect their group's power and status. And they also find that this sense of solidarity predicts support for anti-democratic policies that whites see as preserving their group's power. So the extent to which many white people feel interested in and desire to preserve a lot of the foundations of American democracy are fundamentally tied up in this psychological attachment that white people have toward their group. And in my work, I make a distinction between two types of racial solidarity. The first is a simple identification with a group, a psychological attachment and identity that some people have toward their racial group. And then I talk about the concept of white consciousness. This is a concept that was originally developed by Patricia Gurin and some of her colleagues working at the University of Michigan. And the argument is that white consciousness is distinct from identity in that it is, some people think of it as like identity plus. It's both having this sense of identification, this psychological attachment to one's group, plus a set of ideological beliefs about one's group's standing, as well as a view that collective action, participating in politics, working through the political system collectively as part of this group is the best means by which the group can improve its status and realize its interests. So how do we capture this sense of identity? How do we capture this sense of solidarity? Well, let's take a step back for just a moment. As originally conceived by Henry Tajfel, social identity, whatever that is, whether that's an identification with a racial group or a religious group or an occupational group, so on and so forth, he described it as part of an individual's self-concept, which derives from his knowledge of his membership of a social group or groups, together with the value and emotional significance attached to that membership. And so as the field has grown, people have tended to see social identities as having these two dimensions. One is a cognitive dimension and one is an affective component. And there have been efforts to try to elaborate even more on the potential dimensions of identity. People have made attempts to define and distinguish additional dimensions, but generally efforts to measure group identity reflected this common conception of having a cognitive component and having an affective component. And I'm going to tell you what we mean by that. So the cognitive dimension of identity is the most basic act of self-categorization. It's the response to the question, who am I? We routinely answer this question about ourselves all the time in the United States, particularly with respect to race. We answer this question with respect to race, with respect to nationality, religion, occupation, and so forth. We do this all the time on surveys. We're very good at doing this on surveys, whether we take a survey when we arrive at the doctor's office, if we're participating in public opinion survey, filling out a tax form, so on and so forth. We are constantly asked to participate in the act of self-categorization. And it's argued that in the United States, this is not true in other countries, but in the United States, categorizing ourselves into a racial group is second nature. We identify as Black or white or multiracial or biracial, just in the same way we think of ourselves, think about our gender identities or sexuality. Americans frequently and deliberately engage in racial self-categorization. We check the box that corresponds with our race or ethnicity. And so what I want to mention is that when I talk about the white Americans who I study using survey research that have a sense of white identity, the precursor to having that identity is that all the people that I study on a survey will have marked themselves as a non-Hispanic white person. And so the cognitive dimension is a necessary component of racial solidarity, but it's not sufficient. So not all groups in which we self-categorize are important to our self-concepts. They're not always an important part of identity. They're not always necessarily an important part of the way in which we see ourselves, even if we self-categorize into particular groups. I think that a really nice way of putting this is that identifying as a group member is not the same as identifying with a group member. So you can be American without being patriotic, you can be Jewish without being religious, and so forth. And so what that means is that the affective component becomes a really important dimension for those of us who are interested in studying group identities and the political consequences of these identities. So this is a dimension that we care about, we want to measure more of. The affective dimension captures the strength and significance of a social identity. So it assesses the subjective importance or the centrality of an identity. It gets at this subjective sense of belonging and also these positive valence feelings that we have for members of our in-group. So how do we capture the centrality or significance? Well, in 1976, political scientist Michael Hooper introduced a general measure of identity. It drew on the methods of the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan. And he was using this to develop a measure of attachment or identification with a political party. And he adapted the structure of this measure to create a survey item that could assess individuals' identification with any number of social groups. And it simply asks respondents, how important is it for them to identify with a specific group? So how important is it that you think of yourself as a blank, as a white person, as an African-American, as a Black person, as a Jewish person, so on and so forth. And so this is the item that's most widely available on recent national surveys used to measure racial identity, and arguably it captures the strength of identity. And that's one of its core features. I often use this measure in my own work as a single measure of group identity. I should say that from a measurement perspective, as a one item measure, it's not going to be as valid as a multi-item measure, but if you're interested in this item, one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing in my work and in my book is validating this measure. And I always like to point out that it turns out that we also measure one of the most important central political variables in political science with a single item measure. Party identification is often always asked with a single survey question, rather than with multiple items. And what I find across national public opinion surveys is that when you ask white Americans how important being white is to their identity, somewhere between 30 and 40% of white people report having a sense of racial identification. So we're not talking about a very small subset of white people here. I'm certainly not talking exclusively about white people who we'd say are members of bona fide white supremacist groups. There's a sizable percentage of white Americans who possess a racial identity. Because single item measures, as I say, can sometimes be suspect or they're not as ideal, there is a second item that I often use when I'm doing this with my own work, but it's not usually included on major public opinion surveys, but I advocate for an additional measure that captures the valence that people feel toward this group. And I think with respect to measuring white identity in particular, because whiteness has long had this sort of, obviously like including to the extent to which I'm talking about whiteness today, there are lots of reasons to see this from a negative perspective. Obviously, not a lot of the white people that I'm interested in studying see whiteness as problematic in the way that I'm going to argue it's problematic. But to assess that and to capture that, I ask people, to what extent do you feel that white people in this country have a lot to be proud of? And people can respond anywhere from a great deal or none at all. So this is how I'm capturing identity, but I want to take a moment to think a little bit and talk about how to measure group consciousness, which, as I said, is identity plus. It's identity plus this politicized identification. And this construct has not just the component of identity, but a set of beliefs that accompany this identity. So it's got both identity plus the recognition of a group status. You see your status as either lower than you would prefer it to be, or you see it as where you would like it to be, but in jeopardy or somehow threatened, coupled with a desire for collective action on behalf of the group. You want group members to work together to protect the group or change the group status. So to measure this, I do it with a number of survey questions. First, I include that measure of identity that I mentioned before. How important is being white to your identity? And then to get at these other dimensions, I say, how likely is it that many whites are unable to find a job because employers are hiring minorities instead? How important is it that whites work together to change laws that are unfair to whites? And how much discrimination is there in the United States today against whites? All of these measures, I should say, are available on the American National Election Study. The identity question by itself was first included on the 2012 American National Election Study, and the consciousness items have been included, I believe, on every American National Election time series and pilot study conducted since 2016. And you can find these today on the 2020 American National Election Study, which was just released the past couple of months. And here is the distribution of this measure when I take all of the responses to those survey questions and I scale them together, I average them together. And what I find is that somewhere between 30 and 36% of whites identify as white, and about 30% score in the upper quartile on this consciousness scale. And so again, what the takeaway here is that there is a sizable percentage of white people who possess these beliefs in the United States. And I want to take a moment to talk about a couple other measures of racial solidarity that have been applied to studying white identity or white racial solidarity in the United States. I'm going to talk about group closeness and about the measure of linked fate. So the closeness item was featured on public opinion surveys for a long time. It has not been featured on the American National Election Study in a while. It might still be on the General Social Survey, but sometimes people in their own independent research use this question to capture group identity. And usually people are asked on a survey, you're given a list of groups. You're asked to read over the list and to tell the surveyor which groups you feel particularly close to. Who do you think are you close to with respect to your ideas and interests and feelings about things? This particular question wording I took directly from the American National Election Study. And what I argue and other scholars have argued is that this captures some sense of closeness toward a group, but closeness isn't necessarily the same thing as identification with a group. So it's not quite getting directly at the sentiment. It doesn't have what we necessarily would call the same degree of face validity as we might hope, or as we might find with respect to the direct identity question. The problem too sometimes is that depending on how the question's asked, it often makes crude distinctions between groups that you feel close to and groups that you feel closest to. And one reason that's a problem is that closeness might simply mean the salience of a particular group in a survey context. So you might be thinking about a particular group in that moment, and then you might report feeling close to that group. But if you feel close to multiple groups and something about the survey environment has just made one particular group salient, then we're not necessarily, as survey researchers, doing the best job of capturing a group that you really have a strong sense of identity with, if you're forced to just pick one particular group on a survey. So the closeness items have some important notable limitations. Another measure that people often turn to is this measure of linked fate. Linked fate, or a sense of interdependence, is a concept that's been around for a long time in the study of group identities and social identities. Michael Dawson, I think, made this term most famous, this concept most famous with respect to studying group consciousness and racial solidarity among Black Americans in the United States. And the question is usually phrased something like, what happens to white people or to blank people, whichever identity you're trying to measure in this country, will have something to do with what happens in your life. And people are asked to respond, agree, disagree, and to the extent to which they agree or disagree. Or sometimes they're asked to say, like, to what extent do you think what happens to other people will affect you? And there's some interesting research that's being done that is drawing some skepticism about the utility of this measure today when it comes to measuring group solidarity generally, but even when it comes to measuring racial solidarity among Black Americans. So Claudine Gay and Jennifer Hochschild and Ariel Lay have a paper where they find that a lot of groups in the United States, a lot of people express a sense of linked fate across, and that's with respect to a whole host of different racial groups. So Black Americans seem to have high levels of linked fate. White Americans have high levels of linked fate. Hispanic Americans have high levels. But what they find, surprisingly, is that linked fate is not closely related to group closeness or to perceptions of discrimination or a host of other things that we might expect linked fate ought to be related to if it's in fact capturing the sense of solidarity with a racial group. It's also not strongly associated with political views or political participation. So a lot of scholars have been left wondering, what exactly is linked fate capturing? And I think that we don't quite know the answer to this right now. I think this is an area that's really ripe for exploration. There's some sort of speculation that it's possibly just kind of a noisy measure. For some white people and some racial groups, it may be capturing a sense of identity. And for others, it may be capturing a sense of group closeness, of sort of attachment, of strength of social attachments that people feel. But for the purposes of understanding racial solidarity among white people, a really important caveat that I found in my research, and Michael Dawson has also found this as well with respect to studying white people, is that the correlates of that identity measure I just talked about a moment ago, when you ask people how important is being white to your identity, the things that correlate with that and also correlate with white consciousness are often inversely related to a sense of linked fate among white Americans. And this is pretty important, especially with respect to education. So what I find in my work is that white Americans with higher levels of education tend to have lower levels of identity and consciousness, but they tend to have higher levels of linked fate. And so what this suggests is that white linked fate is capturing something different than white identity or white consciousness. And so I think that what I want to sort of start urging people is to use the linked fate measure as a sense of identity with some caution, and to realize that it very well may not be capturing the same sets of attitudes and beliefs as the identity measure or the consciousness measure. And again, we need to do more work to understand what exactly is this measure capturing. And again, to some extent, this may not have a lot of utility for political scientists because it doesn't seem to be highly predictive of political views or of political participation. Okay, so to turn back a little bit more to the substantive, who are white identifiers? I think that the media over the past 4 years or more has given us a particular impression of a white American who might have a sense of white grievance. Probably when I talk about white identity politics, many of you bring to mind a particular demographic, like maybe a white man who didn't go to college, who works in a manufacturing industry and lives in a rural town. And to some extent, there's some truth to this. But what I wanted to point out here is that if we look at the demographic features of people who have high levels of white identity and people who have low levels of white identity, relative to all whites, there's some surprises. So first, people with higher levels of white identity tend to be somewhat older than people with low levels of identity, but they're not any older than sort of the average white American. They are more likely to be women than to be men, which I think is surprising to a lot of people. This isn't a strong effect, I should say, and there's some variability that I observe with respect to gender differences across surveys, but by and large, I find that women, at least a slightly higher percentage of women, have a strong sense of racial identity than men. When it comes to sort of a key demographic difference, whites high in white identity are less likely to have gone to college than whites low in racial identity. But they aren't likely to be particularly worse off than other white Americans when it comes to their socioeconomic status. They're somewhat in a lower income bracket, but not significantly lower. They're no more likely to be unemployed. They're just as likely as other white Americans to own a house. They're somewhat more likely to self-identify as working class, but 62% of them identify as middle class. And so it's not the case that they're all predominantly found among the working class. And they're not more likely to report a subjective sense of economic grievance. So I think for a long time, there was this story floating around, this narrative that white grievance politics was the politics of the white working class man who had lost his job and was struggling financially. And there really isn't a ton of validity to that story. There are some notable partisan differences. 55% of white people with a high identity identify with the Republican Party, but 31% of them are Democrats. So it's not the case that they're completely found among Republicans in the United States. I think sort of one thing that's kind of interesting is that they're disproportionately likely to identify as political independents, for what it's worth. So now that I've talked a little bit about who they are, let's talk about their consequences. What does white identity predict? What is it associated with? So first, I argued that we ought to find a relationship between white identity and opposition to immigration. And that's because immigrants are viewed by some as threatening this dominant Anglo-Protestant culture. Immigration has contributed to demographic trends where whites are going to be and already are displaced as the numerical majority in the United States. And so the expectation is we ought to find that white racial solidarity ought to be related to anti-immigrant and immigration sentiments, all else equal. And this is what I find really consistently. So here what I'm doing is I'm plotting the predicted level of preference for decreasing levels of immigration in the United States by levels of white identity using the American National Election Study. And what we see quite plainly is that higher levels of white identity are strongly associated with support for decreasing levels of immigration. And this is in a multivariate regression model controlling for a host of things that we think ought to be related to immigration attitudes, including partisanship, political ideology, employment status, personal and national economic evaluations, education, age, gender, and attitudes toward Hispanics in the United States. And so what we observe is that above and beyond outgroup attitudes and all of these other political variables, white identity emerges as a strong and significant predictor of immigration opinion. And it doesn't matter what we ask about immigration, we observe this pattern time and time again. So here we can see that higher levels of white identity in similar regression models are associated with the belief that immigrants take citizens' jobs away. And again, it doesn't matter how I ask, if we're talking about our preference for building a wall along the southern border of the United States, preference for decreasing immigration, the belief that immigrants take jobs away from Americans, that immigrants increase crime in the US. We observe consistently a relationship between white identity, white consciousness, and opposition to immigration and hostility toward immigrants. Let's go back in time a little bit to the 2012 elections. Remember, I talked about Obama as a very symbolic source of political threat. And the idea that white identity ought to be related to opposition to Obama. Now, remember, this is kind of surprising from the perspective of social science because, at the time, Obama, after he was first elected, tons of papers were published discussing the extent to which racial prejudice influenced attitudes towards Obama and had a potential effect on the 2008 election. And then, of course, subsequently as well on the 2012 election. And the argument was that white hostility toward Black people was the predominant predictor of opposition to Obama. But what I find is that white identity also mattered with respect to vote choice. I can tell you this with respect to 2012. Unfortunately, I don't have measures that go back to 2008, although I suspect that white identity was an important force in the electoral politics of white Americans during that time as well. But to give you a sense of how large this effect is, I've plotted here the predicted probability of voting for Obama among people high on identity and low identity, while holding all the other variables in my vote choice model at their means. And what you can see is that moving from low to high identity cuts the probability of voting for Obama by about half. And that's also controlling for racial prejudice. Here I'm using a measure called racial resentment. That's sort of a standard in the discipline, but it doesn't matter what measure of racial prejudice you use, the effect is persistent. And that's a powerful effect. And it lends further credence to the argument that white identity really is a meaningful component of political attitudes and that it's played an important role in electoral politics in the United States. And to give you some sense of why this attitude was persistent with respect to Obama, one of the things that I found is that higher levels of white identity in 2012 were associated with the belief that Obama favors Black Americans over white Americans. So this provides some evidence that this feeling of threat, the concern about loss of privileges because of these demographic changes, because of diversity, because of Obama, are to some extent what underlies the relationship between white identity and white racial solidarity and political attitudes and behavior. So then we get to the 2016 election. And I think one thing that I really find important to point out is that in some ways, Trump had a sort of a playbook in front of him for not just how to appeal to racially resentful or racially hostile white people, but also whites that have this sense of solidarity. And one thing that I think is really notable is that Trump began his 2016 presidential campaign by focusing almost exclusively on the issue of immigration, an issue that I've argued is especially salient and important to white Americans who have been worried about their group status amidst growing immigration in the United States and demographic changes. And so one thing you can do if you are so inclined, you can actually use the Internet Wayback Machine, which archives internet web pages as they exist at particular periods of time. And you can go and look and see the website of Donald Trump's campaign in August of 2015, when Trump began his presidential campaign. And if you click on the positions link at the top of the page, the positions menu, you'll find that the only issue that Trump had on his positions page when he began his campaign was immigration reform. So he began his campaign beating this drum of immigration, of ratcheting up the sense of anxiety and fear and threat that many white Americans had toward immigration, arguably helping to make salient and to prime this sense of racial identity. And so not surprisingly, what I find is that white identity was associated with support for Trump. But here what I'm showing you isn't in the general election, but instead early on when whites were trying to decide which presidential candidate to pick out of the pool of all presidential candidates during the primaries. So this uses the 2016 American National Election Study pilot, which was conducted in January of 2016 during the presidential primaries. And we find is that white identity was associated with the probability of selecting Trump over every other primary candidate. So it wasn't just that white identifiers were necessarily going to be drawn toward any Republican candidate, but instead there was something unique about Trump that drew them in. And to illustrate this point even more directly, if I use the same data to look at the relationship between white identity and feeling thermometer evaluations of the different presidential candidates during the 2016 primary. So these are how questions gauging affect toward candidates, how warm or cold do you feel toward a particular candidate? What you observe is that white identity was not significantly associated with attitudes toward any of their other candidates, whether that was Clinton or Sanders or Cruz or Rubio, but uniquely predicted warmer support or warmer attitudes toward, and therefore greater support for Donald Trump. So there's something about Trump where he had the ability to uniquely tap into this sense of white grievance politics and bring the sets of attitudes to bear on evaluations of him and greater support for his candidacy. So then that gets us to the wake of the Trump presidency. And obviously, we're all aware of the January 6th Capitol riot that took place after Trump raised many questions about the legitimacy of the 2020 election. Despite no evidence of voter fraud in the United States, Trump claimed that the election was illegitimate and that he actually won. This drew obviously a lot of anger and ire from many of his supporters, ultimately culminating in the violent insurrection at the US Capitol on January 6th. And this was, for many commentators and political observers and social scientists, a real sign of the Democratic backsliding that a lot of people had been worrying about over the course of the Trump presidency. And so what I was interested in looking at is observing the extent to which the sense of solidarity among white people might be associated with some anti-democratic principles in the United States, under the auspices of the fact that one way of thinking about democracy in the United States is that it has largely been for white people, and that American democracy has not always been extended to people of color in the United States, and that oftentimes fights over American democracy and what democracy is and who ought to be granted the privileges of American democracy have largely revolved around race in the US. And I think that that's no different today. But what I find quite troublingly, this is using the 2020 American National Election Study, is that white racial consciousness, all else equal, controlling for things like partisanship and political ideology, national and personal economic evaluations, education, age, gender, racial resentment, is associated with greater agreement that having a strong leader in government is good, even if that leader bends the rules a little bit. So you can sort of see how this is very similar to a lot of the complaints that many vocal Trump supporters had about sort of Trump's lack of ability to do what he wanted, sort of unfettered by different groups in the United States. And sort of similarly, white consciousness is associated with the belief that it would be helpful if a president could work on the country's problems without paying attention to what Congress or the courts say. And it's also associated with the belief that it's justified for people to use violence to pursue their political goals. And I should say that generally most Americans are not in favor of using political violence. So like the sort of overall substantive effect here isn't enormous, but nevertheless is notable and persistent. Whites with higher levels of racial consciousness are in fact more supportive than whites lower on racial consciousness of the use of political violence in the United States. And so in conclusion, one thing that I think is really important to understand about the contemporary political landscape is that when it comes to race and politics, whites' preferences and behaviors are not necessarily being solely or even primarily driven by outgroup animus or racial resentment or racial prejudice. That's a huge component of what we're observing in contemporary politics and in racial conflict today. But also embedded in this is a concern about whites' group status, the desire to protect that status, to protect their group's power and resources. This also matters. This plays an important, independent, and significant role in American politics today. And as the demographics of the United States shift, if politicians continue to capitalize on white grievance, then we should expect to see that this is going to persist as a lens through which many white Americans view the political world. This concern about their status, this desire to protect their power, this is going to continue to matter and perhaps increasingly matter. And I think one thing that's really important to think about is that if we care about living in a racially egalitarian society, if we want to achieve a more egalitarian society, then we should worry about white identity politics and the fact that there are these two forces, and that white racial politics isn't just about this hostility, it's also about maintaining power and privilege. And that's, of course, fundamentally a contradiction to achieving a greater degree of racial equality. I think that white identity is also potentially more insidious than racial prejudice in the classic sense. We are quick to condemn politicians for making racist remarks, but I don't think that we're as quick to sanction them when they appeal to white identity politics. And that is something that as a nation, we're going to have to wrestle with today and in the coming years. And so thank you all for tuning in. I'm going to end there, and I look forward to taking your questions and comments.
Thank you so much for that awesome and interesting talk. If you all have questions, you can enter them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or you can just insert them in the chat box, which is also, that's also fine. I'll just, while people are inserting their questions in the chat box, at the end of the talk, you mentioned that individuals are quick to I don't remember how you said it, but you basically said, they're quick to disagree when an individual makes a racist remark, but not so much when they kind of rallies the support of those who, harbor these severe prejudice, which is really unfortunate. So in your view, what options, how could we best combat not just, so it sounds like the answer is just racism, right? As far as the way you're saying is like not prejudice, but kind of, right? As far as willingness to support President Obama and, things like this. And from what I can see, prejudice is kind of in the eye of the beholder that, depending on what it is that we're talking about. I'm trying to perform this. It's just not coming out, but that's okay because now we have questions. So I'll start off with Jen, and she said, I've read some criticisms that traditional racial resentment questions end up getting at traditionally conservative political views, which could undermine their validity. Do you think your battery of white identity questions avoid those pitfalls?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That's a really great question. So one of the concerns about the measure of racial resentment is that it's really capturing this sense of principled conservatism, because arguably people could answer the questions. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with these, some of the questions are things like that you traditionally used to measure racial resentment are like, Irish Italians and Jewish people and other minorities work their way up without special favors. Do you agree or disagree that Black people should do the same in the United States? And the argument is that on its face, people could answer that, white people could answer that question, not because they have some animosity toward Black people in the United States, but actually because they just think that anybody should have to work their way up. Black people are no exception, and that individualism is an important American value that should be applied to everyone, regardless of their race or ethnicity. And so I think that one of the advantages of the racial consciousness and racial identity scale is that it doesn't have, for the most part, there's really no plausible deniability in how you answer the questions that compose the consciousness scale. You can't argue that you are you can't argue that you're answering them because actually you just believe in conservatism. So the structure of them is very different. So I think that is one of the advantages of them. One thing that I want to say in response to that, just to be clear, and I think, Naomi, this speaks to something that you were pointing out in your comment and your question, is that these are not meant to be interchangeable concepts. So I don't think this is necessarily what you were suggesting, Jen, but I just want to say this to be clear. I'm not arguing that white identity is an alternative to racial resentment. I'm arguing that it is a second form of racism that coexists with racial resentment, and that these are two independent forces often working in tandem with each other, but not always. So one of the things I find, for example, in my work is that racial resentment tends to be highly related to policies like welfare and affirmative action that are traditionally associated in the minds of white people with disproportionately benefiting Black Americans. And what I find is that actually white identity isn't predictive of those policies. So for the most part, it's not associated with policies that white people see as benefiting people of color. It's in fact, and it tends to mostly be associated with policies that white people see as helping them or helping their group. Now, another point that you were making, Naomi, that I think is really important to clarify is that that's not because white identity is not a form of racism. It is not a form of prejudice narrowly defined as the outgroup attitudes that some people have toward other groups. But my overall argument is it's another form of racism, and that racism comes in different flavors and different forms with different consequences, different psychological origins. And unfortunately, for the ability of politicians to potentially draw on these different forms of racism or capitalize on them and exploit them for political gain in the United States. So thanks for that question, Jen.
No, that's an extremely helpful lens to think about racism. Not just, okay, racism is one thing. And you know what? Darren Davis said it best when he described prejudice as just one component of of racism, right? How we think about measuring, especially along the lines of studying public opinion and the typical measures that we usually depend on, only focus on one component to this very multifaceted concept of racism. So I'll move on to the next question from Mallory. She says, how do you explain Trump gaining so much support in the Midwest if most white identifiers are not a part of the working class?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Mallory. So there are a couple of things I think are important to notice and keep in mind. So one is that it's not that there aren't a lot of working class whites who have a strong sense of identity. There are. The point that I want to make is that there are also a lot of white Americans who aren't working class, either by subjective or objective standards, who also have a sense of white identity. So I think the popular narrative in the United States has been that white grievance politics is the politics of the white working class. And part of what I'm arguing is that actually it's the politics of a lot of white Americans, regardless of their socioeconomic circumstances. But the other caveat that I always want to make here is that where I do find a strong effect is when it comes to the demographic characteristics associated with having a higher level of white identity. Education really emerges as a distinct predictor. So whites who didn't go to college are far more likely than those who did to adopt this sense of racial solidarity. And sometimes when we think about what it means to be working class in the United States, we don't just mean necessarily occupation, we don't necessarily mean income, but sometimes we do mean, did you go to college or not? And so that if you think about class, if you think about it by that definition, it is the case that white identifiers are disproportionately not college educated. But I think that, you know, the sort of flip side of a coin is really important to acknowledge, is that the story of white grievance politics in the United States is not just limited to the working class. It goes beyond that.
That's also another awesome and interesting question as we continue to break down this concept and further understand the role of education, right? As you just clearly described, it's like class. Did you go to college or not? Let's just keep it simple. Okay, the next question is from Muna Adam. Okay, thank you so much for a great talk. Big props to Ashley. How do you think the strength of white identity or white solidarity have changed over the past 4 years of the Trump presidency? It's a two-part question. And it seems to me that white people, especially the younger cohorts, are slowly moving away from holding a strong white identity, perhaps as a consequence of the Trump presidency over time, or just because they want a way to show solidarity with other minority groups.
Yeah, thanks so much. There's so much packed into this, and I'm really excited that you asked me about this, because you sort of teed me up to talk about a paper that I published in political psychology with Nathan Calmo and Kim Gross. And so one of the things that we observe over time across these national public opinion surveys is that there has been a slight decline in the propensity for white people to report a strong sense of racial identity. And we were interested in trying to understand this decline that happened notably right after the 2016 presidential election. And what we find is that coinciding with, I think, a lot of sort of refreshing news coverage that started to talk about white identity as a form of racism and to associate it with white supremacist groups, not unreasonably, even though, you know, to my point that I made at the beginning of the talk is that the white Americans who have these attitudes are far greater than people who identify with the KKK. Most of these white people would never say they identify with the KKK, even though to some extent they may hold similar political attitudes and preferences to bona fide white supremacists. But the sort of, I think, thing to keep in mind is like there was a lot of negative coverage and a lot of coverage right around the Trump election in 2016, sort of bringing this term to the fore. I mean, one of the things I noticed just anecdotally, because when I started doing this work a long time ago, actually, well before the 2016 election, I created a Google search for the term white identity, where I would get in my email any news articles that use the term, and I could just sort of see an acceleration. And so one of the things that we do in this paper is we look to see, was there increased coverage of the term white identity? And we find, in fact, there was a huge spike in coverage talking about the idea of white identity right around the 2016 election. And what we find is that many white Americans who otherwise report a sense of white identity, but were disgusted with Donald Trump, showed a decline in their levels of white identity. We're using panel data to observe this after the election. And so if there's room for optimism, and I want to be optimism about racism in the United States, but I tend to be more, I think of a realist and more pessimistic. But I do think that what this shows is that there are still norms around race and racism in the US that people do not want to violate. And if the media and political elites continue to associate white identity with white supremacism and with racism, then there's some hope that this might cause, to some extent, a decline in whites' willingness to adopt this identity. Now, here's another important caveat. What we don't find is that the white people who reported feeling disgusted with Trump and then therefore were less likely to report a strong sense of white identity after the election, that they then meaningfully changed their attitudes on other issues that are associated with white identity, like opposition to immigration. So they didn't become less opposed to immigration. They didn't become more racially progressive in their attitudes and beliefs. So if anything, this is sort of like cheap talk. There's a taboo potentially developing around this sense of identity, but it's not extending to the sets of attitudes and beliefs that a lot of these people have about race and about politics. So I think that's something that is really important to keep in mind. I think the other thing, though, is that even though there's been a slight decline in levels, what we're also observing is an increase in the extent to which this sense of solidarity matters in politics, and the extent to which it's spilling over into a host of other things. So I just read a really great working paper by Michael Tesler and John Sides and Lynn Vaverick that makes this very point. They're finding that white racial consciousness is associated with a bunch of policies tied to Donald Trump in ways that it wasn't before. So their argument is that Trump really rang this bell and really activated this. And the last thing that I want to say in response to your question is that on the flip side, we are also seeing among many white Americans a decline in levels of racial prejudice. Not the same white Americans. So it's not whites who are high in white identity, but there have been some white people who were, I think, more ambivalent, who over the course of the Obama era, accelerating with the 2016 election, reporting increasingly progressive racial attitudes. So the one way to think about this, again, in sort of the realm of trying to be optimistic, is that white Democrats today are the most racially progressive they have ever been. And so there's a lot of happening right now. There's a lot that's changing when it comes to the landscape of white racial attitudes in the United States.
That's really interesting. I love that you mentioned the cheap talk, comment, right? So as you think about like this moment, and you mentioned in your book, and you even delved into a little bit in the talk of everything that's kind of led up until this moment. And it does kind of make you think like, whites are reporting, even white Democrats, more progressive attitudes than ever. Is that just a product of this moment, or is this something that we can expect on the long term? So with that, I'll move on to the next question, because I'll leave that, to marinate. Have you found any relationship between religion and white identifiers?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think one that really speaks to another sort of part of the sociological discourse of what's happening in the United States, where a lot of people are talking not just about the numerical decline of white people, and the sort of sense of grievance politics found among some white people, but there's a lot of this has been focused on white Christians and on white evangelicals. So I do find a small correlation between I want to say between identifying as evangelical and having a higher level of white identity, but I want to be really precise about this. So I've looked at the relationship between white identity and religion using the American National Election Study. And the way in which religious denomination is measured on the survey can be sort of complicated, and it's actually a little difficult to single out white evangelicals. So the way that I've done this in my work is I've looked at the relationship between white people who have a sense of identity and the belief in biblical inerrancy, or the belief that the Bible is the word of God. And so what people who adopt that belief are more likely to be white evangelicals. And I do find an effect. It's not enormous, it's not overwhelming, but I also think that this is an area that's really ripe and important for ongoing research, because it's clear that race and religion are really deeply tied in the United States in ways that are changing and transforming and becoming increasingly important in the political landscape right now. And I think thinking about what this means and about what whiteness means, like in church and in the church and among Christians, is really important. So I've found a small relationship, but I think that I have barely revealed the tip of an iceberg here.
Oh, interesting. That's really interesting. So I'll move on to the next question. Have you done any research on the relationship between interracial contact and white identity and white consciousness?
Yeah, this is a good question. And actually, to some extent, this was the motivating question for some of the origins of this work in the first place. So there is a long tradition of doing research, to some extent coming out of Blaylock's work, thinking about interracial conflict and thinking about the threats that some white Americans may perceive by living in areas with a higher percentage of people of color, particularly Black Americans. And so there's all this work that was done in social psychology and political science, looking at the relationship between the diversity of one's locale and feelings of racial animosity and racial prejudice. And sort of implicit in that work was that you lived in an area, you felt that your racial group was threatened by increased diversity or greater diversity. And then subsequently, you displayed outgroup hostility or outgroup prejudice. So sort of the model that a lot of people were running with was that high levels of interracial conflict or proximity to racial diversity led to a sense of identity that then led to a sense of prejudice. And one of the things I always found really unsatisfying with this work is it never measured the identity. It just went from do you live in an area with greater racial diversity? And if so, are you more likely to have higher levels of racial prejudice than people who don't live in an area of greater racial diversity? It's we're missing the middle component here. And so I have done some work looking at whether white identity matters more to people's political attitudes or preferences in places where the change in the foreign-born population has been greater. And I do observe some effect there. I haven't been able to do what I think is really good, important work that is in the vein of the contact hypothesis, which is that the more meaningful, cooperative contact that people have across racial groups, the more likely that is to reduce feelings of racial conflict. And so sort of important question is does that reduce the consequences of white identity? Does it lower levels of white identity? You could also imagine sort of having the opposite effect depending on the racial context, right? If a white person finds themselves in a space where they are not the majority, where they're not surrounded by a lot of white people, which often it turns out does not happen to most white people most of the time in the United States, but in the circumstances in which they do find themselves, you could imagine that actually increases the salience of their identity. So there are all these hypotheses going in all these different ways. And I think that it's a great place to do more work. It's also, that kind of work is often difficult because it's hard to kind of create these real world studies where you can experimentally manipulate this type of conflict. But I think that it's worth thinking through and worth doing. And so I encourage people who are interested in this to think about that as an area of future research.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. Moving on to the next question, because we have a few coming in through the Q&A. Karen asks, how does your work help us to understand conservative criticism of critical race theory and the notion of white racial privilege?
I think there are a lot of layers to this. So one, on the face, it's that critical race theory just represents another threat to white Americans' dominance in the United States and their ability to sort of set the public discourse and public narrative, right? I mean, I think that part of the way in which white people have helped maintain their power in the United States and helped sort of subordinate different racial groups and also to sort of dismiss racism as a way, like as a strategy, like to sort of say like that racism doesn't exist, and that, so therefore you cannot cry racism or complain about racism, is by denying a lot of the really egregious, deeply problematic, troubling, terrible ways in which white racism has been a part of American society. So I think a lot of conservative white people see critical race theory as sort of a threat to that, and as a threat to their ability to do that. And I think this sort of more broadly, there's a resistance to talking about the things that we would want to talk about in a pluralistic, multiracial society, which is the experience of different racial and ethnic groups and how whiteness has structured that experience. And so, I mean, this is just part of the politics, I think, of white grievance politics, of white racism in the United States. And, I think that we're likely to see sort of more of this in the coming years as white people start to wrestle with diversity and the growing diversity of the US.
Wow, wonderful answer, wonderful answer. Okay, how do you control for white identifiers not honestly answering the survey questions because they don't want to be perceived as racist? So this kind of social desirability question.
Yeah, so social desirability problems, as you probably imagine, potentially plague all types of public opinion surveys. But what I found in my own research, sort of frustratingly, well, let me step back and say one thing. So one thing is, to some extent, I can't control for this entirely. But the thing that I always say from a social science perspective is that means that all of my estimates are conservative ones, right? So the expectation is that fewer white people are answering affirmatively than the sort of true number of white people in the population who have this sense of identity. And if more people answered truthfully, I would just find a stronger effect. So so to some extent, all of this is conservative. But I want to say first, most of the survey work that's being done in the United States today, most of the work that I've done, most of the surveys I've relied on are surveys that have been done anonymously on the internet. So the sort of cloak of anonymity allows people, as we know, for better or worse, for anyone who's ever read the comment section of any news page or on Facebook or whatever, gives people a lot of freedom to answer questions without the fear of social desirability. It's not that it eliminates it entirely. So one thing that I found is interesting is the 2012 American National Election Study, and I believe the 2016, to try to mitigate social desirability concerns when asking questions about race. And that's regardless if we're talking about racial resentment or racial stereotypes or white identity, use this CASI method, this computer assisted survey interview, where they would just give the tablet over to the respondents that they were otherwise interviewing face to face and allow them to answer the questions on their own in silence without having to report their answers to the survey researcher. But I do observe, actually, even under the CASI circumstances, a small race of interviewer effect, where white people interviewed by a Black interviewer report lower levels of white identity. So we don't mitigate it entirely. What that means for me in my work is, when possible, when I'm working with face-to-face interview data, I control for the race of the interviewer to help deal with this. But the sort of real point that I want to make in response to your important question is that white people are surprisingly willing to report their racial attitudes on surveys without very little reservation. And I know this because in some of the other work that I do, I'm focused on more egregious forms, more overt forms of racial prejudice. And I'm looking at how those relate to white support for punitive criminal justice policies in the United States. And my co-author, Spencer Piston, and I find that white Americans are willing to report very egregious, very overt racial attitudes on surveys without reservation. So I think that social desirability concerns, not something that we should entirely ignore, but not something that we actually need to be as concerned about as I think that some people might worry about.
That's a great answer. I do have one little follow-up question to that, the question that you just answered. And thinking that there are a great number of individuals that don't, are not willing to just be socially desirable and give the answers that they feel like are appropriate. where do you think the role of like literature such as like new racism and thinking that, there's racism hiding behind these other, policy preferences or political affiliations, where do you think that that falls in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I pointed out at the end of the talk is this sort of concern about the ability for politicians to talk about kind of white grievance or white identity politics without it seemingly being racist. And that's part of what I think is insidious about this, is that because identity politics for people of color has been such an important part of their ability to achieve political incorporation in the United States, it also means that white people in the US have observed identity politics as an effective political strategy. And one of the things I argue is that they have co-opted it in really problematic ways, and have sort of run with this argument that if people of color can use identity politics, then white people ought to use identity politics too. And sort of the seemingly innocuous way of putting this is well, if Black Americans get a Black History Month, why don't white Americans get a White History Month? And right, of course, that belies the complete understanding of structural racism in the United States and the fact that otherwise American history is white history, and that we need these spaces because we have subjected people of color to subordination, and have ignored their group and their accomplishments and their contributions to history. But for most white Americans, I think that there's both a willful ignorance about structural racism, a sincere ignorance about structural racism, and therefore a sort of willingness to see white identity politics as just another legitimate form of identity politics sort of in the political landscape, ignoring the fact that really it's in the service of hierarchy maintenance, and that it is very much counter to efforts to achieve racial equality in the US.
Okay. Another question. So what do you think it will take before whites will support policies that do not directly benefit themselves or their group without feeling threatened? Well, this has a lot of layers. For example, under what condition do you think the strength of white identity does not translate into feelings of group threat? Or do you think group threat, at least for some, will continue to be even more inevitable as a result of demographic change?
Yeah, I think that there is to some extent, there's some inevitability to this, that the demographic change was going to always be threatening to white Americans, right? Because it fundamentally challenges the ability for white people to sort of cast the image of what it means to be American, when it comes to seeing themselves as prototypical Americans. I think that, that's sort of part of it. But I also don't think that the extent to which we're seeing white identity politics as part of the contemporary landscape was inevitable to the degree to which we observe it now. I think that Donald Trump exploited this in a way that the Republican Party wasn't necessarily going to exploit. Just think about the political campaigns of John McCain or Mitt Romney and compare that to the strategy of Donald Trump, or really to the strategies of the other Republican frontrunners. I think Donald Trump saw a can of worms and opened it, that the Republican Party probably, it wasn't it wasn't that they were oblivious to this, but I think that they saw it as violating racial norms that they thought was likely to backfire. And it turns out that that this didn't backfire, that this really spoke to a lot of white people. But I sort of see it as a well that politicians can choose or not choose to tap into. And they have chosen to tap into it because they see it as really politically effective and strategic. But I think in the long run, it's not an effective strategy. It's a short-term strategy that I think, as the United States becomes a more racially pluralistic society, is going to be a problem for the Republican Party, for the most part, that has chosen to tap into this. And it's not the case that Democrats can't or won't. There's a potential that they will do that as well. But they don't have the same. They have the constraint of potentially alienating the base that is composed of people of color, and that's a really important base for them. I think the other thing to say too is that what I often find when it comes to white identifiers is, yeah, they feel threatened, but that doesn't always manifest itself necessarily in a desire to like take things away from people of color. Now, again, in the grand forest for the trees, it's still about preserving a racial hierarchy. That's a problem. But I think a lot of white people who have this sense of identity, they don't begrudge like government resources going toward people of color. They just also want to believe that government resources are going to them, right? So one of the places I find this sort of distinctions is I've asked white Americans whether they would support or oppose increasing federal spending for different racial groups. And white identity is actually associated with a preference to increase spending for all racial groups, but especially for white people. And so I think one way of thinking about this is that white Americans want more government. They want to believe that government's doing stuff for them, and it is, but maybe that's that politicians, especially Democrats, aren't doing a good job of selling to them that they are being helped, they are getting resources. And I think the other way, thinking about this is that things don't have to be framed in zero sum. We can reduce feelings of threat and animosity and anxiety among the subset of white Americans. And so, but politicians have to be pressured and motivated to do this. But I think the sort of, at the end of the day, a lot of white people like want resources for them, think that they're not getting resources, think that people of color are getting resources, and politicians have escalated that belief rather than doing the opposite, which they could do, which is to temper those beliefs.
Okay, well, just to follow up with that, what would be the incentive to do that, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? So if, opening this can of worms, as you said, right, led to all of this political success, what would be the incentive to, go against the racism grain?
Yeah. So one of the things that I argue and that I find is that white identity is strongly related to support for Social Security because white Americans see this as a policy that disproportionately benefits whites. And Nick Winter, I think, has done some really important work showing that white identity, that Social Security has been long tied to whiteness, in part because it's been framed in opposition to welfare. Welfare is associated with these erroneous stereotypes about Black people's failure to sort of work hard and want to take advantage of the system. And Social Security was like literally framed by politicians as an effort to try to garner support for the policy in opposite terms as a policy that's for like hardworking people, for white people. And so I find there's a pretty significant relationship between white identity and support for Social Security. Now, one of the things that's unique about Donald Trump is that he parted ways from the traditional Republican Party platform and argued that he was going to protect and preserve Social Security. That's not something that traditionally Republican candidates do. Usually they run on platforms trying to privatize or reduce Social Security in the United States. Trump, uniquely went after this subset of white people by arguing he was going to protect this policy. But, this is a policy that's normally under the purview of the Democratic Party platform, right? So the Democrats could think about how do we embrace messaging that targets this group of white people by telling them we are going to give them more government benefits. We're going to protect Social Security, right? Change the narrative, shift away from the threat of immigration and focus on like, what's government going to do for you and for your group? And I think that there's space to do that.
Wonderful. Okay, moving on. Okay, Dr. Kanisha Wright has a question. Well, two questions, actually. Is there a correlation between this measure of white racial identity and common measures of group consciousness or racial resentment? And the second question is, do you think it's possible that attitudes non-Latinx whites hold toward immigrants, immigration, opinions of the former President Barack Obama, perceptions of leader predict the strength of white racial identity? So, apologize.
Yeah. Okay. So first question, is there a correlation between this measure and common measures of group consciousness or racial resentment? So there is a relationship between white racial identity and racial resentment. And what I find is that the correlation is like surprisingly low. So it's usually somewhere between 0.2 and 0.3, which means that it's not the case that all people high in white identity also have high levels of racial resentment and vice versa. And part of that is also because there are a lot of white Americans who have a sense of or have high levels of racial resentment, but don't possess a racial identity. So they're not one and the same, they're distinct. It's often why I include them together in models. I'm interested in the effect of both white identity and white consciousness net racial resentment or racial prejudice, or above and beyond racial resentment and racial prejudice. And sometimes they find that they're working together in tandem to predict the same things, and sometimes they have different predictive utility. So racial resentment does a really good job predicting white opposition to policies in the United States that white people see as benefiting Black people. Oftentimes they see it as unfairly benefiting Black people, like affirmative action, like welfare. Don't find a relationship with respect to white identity and support for those policies, which I think is really interesting. So the other question, like, what's the sort of direction of causality is immigration, or our immigration attitudes, for example, or our attitudes towards Obama driving levels of white identity. I think that's not something that we can rule out entirely, right? And like, you know, politics is messy. We don't live like in worlds in which we adopt our identities in isolation, in vacuums, right? Surely like they are, to some extent, this was the product of, or the development of, or a response to some of these other attitudes. But generally, we think of identities as predispositions that then inform political attitudes and behaviors, and not vice versa. But it doesn't mean things aren't going in different directions. So, you know, sort of to this point, I think there's a lot of movement right now happening in the political realm when it comes to racial attitudes in ways that scholars have kind of ignored for a long time. So I've been really interested and excited about the work that Andrew Engelhardt has been doing on this, looking at changing levels of racial resentment. He finds that racial resentment, which we long thought of as a predisposition that was really stable over the course of people's lives, has actually been changing in response to partisanship. Partisan identities have become so strong and powerful that they want all of their other attitudes and beliefs to align with their partisanship. And so they're changing their racial attitudes. And I found some corroborating evidence in work that I've done with Peter Enns, where we find that using panel data, white Americans who supported Donald Trump early in the 2016 presidential campaign actually changed their attitudes on racial policies, including on immigration policy, to align with Trump. So it wasn't, so the sort of takeaway from that is that it's not that Trump necessarily solely drew already anti-immigrant, anti-Black white people and appealed to them. Actually, what he did is there were people who just liked him for other reasons that then changed their attitudes on immigration policy, on policy toward Black Americans, to become more conservative because they liked Trump. And I think that we might observe some of the same stuff happening. And I think one thing that's really exciting is there's some panel data that is coming out, like the 2020, for example, ANES has a panel that includes respondents that also took the 2016 survey. So there's a lot of space to do data work right now, looking at changing racial attitudes, potentially changing white racial identity. But the sort of thing I want to say just too in response to that is that really until the 2016 election, looking across time with about 7 different data sets starting in 2010, I generally observed a lot of stability in these attitudes. So there wasn't a lot of shifting until Trump. And so that leads me to think that it's not the case that attitudes towards immigration were like really driving white identity, but instead that was a belief that was already formed that was then getting brought to bear on a lot of immigration attitudes.
Okay, and I'll take one last question. You talk about white racial consciousness as being about the protection of white racial dominance. Are most whites high on white racial consciousness cognizant of their motivation to actively protect white racial dominance? Is that how they interpret their own white racial consciousness?
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. So as part of some of the early work I did on this, I was interested in the possibility that a lot of white people were answering the racial identity question in like the sort of racially progressive way, that they feel a sense of of privilege, as part of like a move toward greater racial egalitarianism, kind of in the sort of social justice sense. And there are some white people who do answer the identity question that way for that reason. There aren't many of them. And I think that a lot of those people are sort of in the multivariate models that I do. When you control for education, you sort of control for the effects of that. But in the spirit of wanting to know more about this, I looked at the relationship between white identity and a sense of white privilege, using survey questions that ask white people, like, do you feel that your group is privileged or advantaged? And I found a positive relationship. Higher levels of white identity were somewhat associated with higher levels of white privilege. And I was like, oh, wait, so am I capturing this progressive identity? Is that what's happening here? And it turns out no, which probably doesn't surprise you given the fact that white identity is really a good predictor of like support for Donald Trump, for example. And so I dug deeper into this by doing some open-ended survey work where I asked white people to explain their responses to the questions that I was asking about consciousness and about identity. And what I found time and time again is that a lot of white Americans explained their higher levels of identity and consciousness by saying things like, yeah, I recognize that I'm privileged as a white person, and I like that. I realize that it would be harder to be a minority in the United States, but I don't want my life to change. I don't want anyone to take that from me. So actually, I think this is where something that we've actually been missing in thinking about racism. We think about white privilege as this like progressive recognition, but actually a lot of these white people know that their group has advantages, that they're better off, and they don't want someone to take that away. So they are very overtly aware that whiteness imbues them with these advantages that could be taken, and therefore that the sense of threat they feel is a conscious sense of threat.
That's really interesting. So just to follow up, that was the last question, but I'm just gonna follow up, with just one last little point. As you said, like, so the threat that they feel is a conscious threat. So to the last question, yes, they are aware of their sense of privilege. So yeah, I'm gonna leave that alone. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Thank you, all of the wonderful attendees, for all of your gracious questions. We really appreciate you coming to tonight's lecture. Ashley, if you could stay on for just a few minutes once everyone leaves. Thank you so much for attending the final lecture of the ICPSR summer program. Thank you all so much. You can reach Ashley Jardina from Duke University at her contact information on her website. Thank you so much and have a good night.
Thank you.